Hello, I just got over a bad case of norovirus. That was the sickest I've ever felt, and it got me thinking of this old Edgar Allan Poe story, The Masque of the Red Death. You guys ever read it? It's good. And you know what? If you stay to the end of this video, I will read it to you. It came out in 1842 in Graham's Magazine, which was the bee's knees to the ladies and gents out in Philly. They offered Poe a whopping $12 for the story, which he gladly accepted because, as you might be able to guess, his life was a bit of a mess. Born in 1809, his father abandoned him the year after his birth. The year after that, his mother died from tuberculosis. Poe was subsequently raised by foster parents John and Frances Allen in Richmond, Virginia. Frances loved Poe as one of her own. John Allen, not so much. A wealthy merchant and self-proclaimed self-made man, he thought supporting Poe through college was a total waste of time and money, supposing the kid was just spending all day gambling and hanging out with his loser friends, which, yeah, that is exactly what he was doing. After racking up a solid gambling debt, Poe went back to his foster dad, hat in hand, and when John Allen said no, Poe said, "Forget this, I'm joining the army." By 1831, after a short stint, Poe then found himself expelled from West Point after a court-martial found him guilty of gross neglect of duty and disobeying orders. So Poe said, "Forget this, I'm becoming a writer." He moved between Baltimore, Richmond, Philadelphia, and New York in search of work and stability. In 1833, he won a $50 prize for a short story, M.S. Found in a Bottle, which I think we can all agree today would not fly as a good title. He took an editorial position with the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond, and in 1836, married his cousin, Virginia Clem, who was only 13 years old. We don't have time to get into it. Now, by all accounts, Poe was actually a devoted husband. His editorial stint in Richmond, however, proved a bit turbulent. He was reportedly dismissed for drunkenness by 1837. Poe then moved to Philadelphia, a hub of publishing where he edited Burton's Gentleman's Magazine and later Graham's Magazine. This period saw him write some of his most famous early tales. By 1839, he had published the horror masterpiece The Fall of the House of Usher, and in 1840, his first collection, Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque. In 1841, while editing Graham's, Poe pioneered the detective genre with The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which brought him a bit of acclaim. Yet even with a growing bibliography and literary fame, steady financial success continued to elude him. Magazine editors in those days paid meager sums. Poe's continuous job changes, in which he often left positions due to frustration, substance abuse issues, and magazine bankruptcies, kept him perpetually short on money, and at times he resorted to writing sensational hoaxes or even entering story contests to earn cash. For example, The Gold Bug won a $100 prize in 1843. This chronic financial instability and professional uncertainty contributed to the anxious, at times feverish tone of his writing. Tragedy was a constant companion to Poe, shaping the themes of his work. Tuberculosis, in particular, haunted him as an ever-present ghost. He had already lost his biological mother to consumption, and in 1829, his foster mother, Frances Allen, likewise died of the disease. His elder brother, Henry, succumbed to an illness, likely tuberculosis, in 1831. Most devastating of all, in January of 1842, his beloved Virginia began coughing up blood, the first sign of the tuberculosis that would eventually take her life. Poe was deeply shaken by Virginia's illness. Private letters reveal Poe describing himself as nearly insane with grief and worry. That year, Poe published The Masque of the Red Death, a story seemingly painted in blood, where scarlet stains and profuse bleeding are a recurring theme. Poe scholars are in near agreement that the details of the story were inspired by Virginia's lung hemorrhage earlier that year. It reads like something written by a man staring death in the face and realizing that it will not only come for everyone that he loves, but also, one day, for him too. Now, it's also important to understand the world that Poe was living in. In the 1840s, death by disease was the fear of everyone. The big terrors hanging over America at the time were tuberculosis and cholera. Tuberculosis, known as consumption in those days, was the leading cause of death in the country, responsible for perhaps 1 in every 4 or 5 fatalities. The disease was ubiquitous and pitiless. It struck down young and old, rich and poor, because it often lingered, consuming its victims slowly. TB had an enormous cultural footprint. This one guy wrote a book about it. You should read it. Americans were, in those days, obsessed with consumption. It was the subject of poems and songs. As one historian notes, before antibiotics, tuberculosis was a national fixation and the scourge of artists. The illness was simultaneously feared for its deadly nature and yet strangely romanticized for the pale, fragile seeming beauty of its sufferers. By the 1830s and 40s, a whole slew of consolation literature emerged to help people cope with the ubiquity of consumption. Sentimental poems and stories described dying young women wasting away with poetic grace, stressing Christian resignation and heavenly reunions. Children in Sunday schools read tales of pious little girls accepting death from consumption as part of God's will. Basically, 1840s Americans lived in a culture that constantly reminded them that death could come early, and that one must seek moral meaning in this. At the same time, Americans were also confronted with a more sudden, ghastly specter called cholera. The world's second cholera pandemic reached the United States in 1832, just a decade before Poe's story. Cholera was a fast-acting infection that could kill a healthy person in mere hours through dehydration and shock. It first hit in port cities. New York and Philadelphia saw deadly outbreaks in the summer of 1832, with thousands dying and many more fleeing in panic. Over the next few years, cholera spread along American waterways and trade routes, causing periodic outbreaks throughout the 1840s. Unlike tuberculosis' slow burn, cholera was a terrifying sprint. Victims might be struck down in a few hours, collapsing with cramps and vomiting. The sign of cholera victims was horrifying. Their skin often turned a gray-blue, their eyes sunken and blood thick, earning cholera the grim nickname the Blue Death. In Poe's The Masque of the Red Death, the story's fictional plague causes profuse bleeding at the pores and scarlet spots. But interestingly, Poe stages the first appearance of the Red Death at a party in an Eastern Blue room. My point is that disease outbreaks were not distant history at the time of this story's publication. They were part of both living memory and current events. With this all in mind, let's dive into the tale and trace how it unfolds. Poe opens by plunging readers into a nightmare scenario. It's the Middle Ages in an unspecified European countryside, and a mysterious plague called the Red Death is devastating the land. In one grim paragraph, he describes its horrors. This disease kills swiftly. Victims are overcome by sharp pains, sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores, dying within half an hour. The contagion is so lethal and hideous that it causes widespread panic and social collapse. The most chilling sign of the illness are the scarlet stains that it leaves on the body, and especially the face, marking the stricken as doomed for death. At the first sign of these spots, a carrier is expelled from society to try and prevent further spread. After the Red Death has killed half of the people in this unnamed country, we're introduced to Prince Prospero, the wealthy and headstrong, eccentric ruler of the kingdom. With the disease raging, the prince decides to take drastic action to insulate himself and all of high society from the Red Death. He invites 1,000 of his healthy, carefree, aristocratic friends to his lavish estate, and together they seal themselves inside. This fortress-like castle is surrounded by a high stone wall and iron gates. Prospero and company weld the doors shut, determined that no one will enter or leave until the plague has run its course outside. They stockpile enough provisions and distractions to last them for months. Prospero is described as happy and dauntless and sagacious, utterly untroubled by the suffering going on outside. After all, the betters are all inside the estate, safe and sound, and he has arranged a seemingly unending program of wine, food, music, dancers, buffoons, storytellers, every kind of entertainment imaginable. In short, the prince creates a hedonistic haven, while the external world could take care of itself. The name Prince Prospero is, of course, a bit on the nose. Prosperity meaning the state of having great wealth and riches. The idea is that this prince is so rich and well-to-do that he reckons his estate can be utilized as a means to cheat fate, that his immense wealth can wall out death itself. It's worth noting that Poe doesn't describe the prince using any of his riches to aid the sick or alleviate suffering in his kingdom. The poor, if they are mentioned in this story, merely exist to provide entertainment and service for the elites. In fact, the prince's attitude is that it is folly to grieve or to think about the people who are suffering from the plague outside of the castle walls. Thus, Prospero shirks his duties as a prince. Instead of protecting or caring for his subjects, his attitude seems to be they are on their own. Within the castle is security, without is the Red Death. It's also worth noting that in this story, this place of refuge was originally an abbey, a place normally associated with piety. In his story, Poe subverts it into a pleasure palace, perhaps a subtle critique on the various religions of the 19th century. Perhaps not. After several months of isolation, Prospero decides to put on this elaborate masquerade ball to amuse his guests, which takes place in 7 interconnected rooms of the abbey. These rooms are arranged in an unconventional way. Instead of a long, straight vista, they wind in sharp turns so that you can only see one room at a time. Each room has a distinct color theme. The party starts in the blue room, then purple, then green, then orange, white, violet, and finally black. Each room has wall hangings and stained glass windows, all of the same hue, and while the black room is draped in black velvet, notably its windows are not black, but instead a deep blood red. In each room, instead of lamps, firelight from the corridor casts light through the colored glass, producing a surreal illumination so that each chamber feels like a dream. But the firelight shining through the red glass in the black room creates such ghastly effects that almost no one dares to enter it during the festivities. The most striking feature of all is a gigantic ebony clock standing against the western wall of the black room. This clock has a deep, melodious, but peculiarly disconcerting chime, and every hour when it strikes, its sound is so loud and haunting that the orchestra stops playing, the dancers halt, and everyone is momentarily frozen in uneasy contemplation until the ringing subsides. Then, inevitably, nervous laughter ensues, and the party resumes until the next hour, when the chime again freaks everybody out. This routine goes on and on throughout the night, and as the clock progresses toward midnight, even the giddiest guests begin to grow pale whenever the clock tolls. Nevertheless, the masquerade is wildly fantastical. Poe describes how there was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust in the guests' chosen costumes. And while the literary sensibilities of the time probably prevented Poe from explicitly spelling out the details of this lavish party, Victorian readers certainly understood that this ball was not a polite waltz, but rather a fever dream of indulgence, of sensuality, moral corruption, what the old King James simply calls superfluity of naughtiness, simmering beneath the masks that the partiers wore. Okay, so what's the deal with these different colored rooms and their weird layout and decorations? Poe never states anything outright, but the layout and the colors are likely doing some heavy allegorical lifting. First, there's the space itself. It goes from east to west, which of course may reference sunrise and sunset, perhaps a lifelong journey. There are 7 rooms. 7 was a highly symbolic number that Victorians associated with completeness. Think the biblical sevens, the 7 ages of man. So again, the implication would be the whole span of human life. The different colors likely indicate the different stages of life. The blue room in the east could indicate the dawn or birth and new beginnings. Purple could indicate early vitality and ambition. Green, the color of vegetation, meaning growth, the prime of one's life. Orange, ripeness, maturity, like late afternoon light. White, being a sign of age, things thinning out. Violet, twilight, waning sunset, the day almost gone. Black, with scarlet pains, death, and blood. Also, could just be a bunch of random colors. The black room, though, seems clearly symbolic of death. Decorated in funeral black with red windows, Poe's emphasis that the effect of the red light on the black surroundings was ghastly in the extreme, and cast such a dread on faces that few dared to venture in. It's as if this final room embodies the reality of death that everyone at the party is trying to avoid. The ebony clock is clearly a symbol of the relentless march of time. Every time the clock chimes, the party grinds to a halt. Poe writes that after the echo of the chime fades and the revelers laugh nervously at their prior apprehension and then go back to partying, they vow that the next chiming would not throw them into such disconcert. But of course, it always does. So it is with us today. We go about and we live and we party and we suppress thoughts of death with busy celebrations, yet periodically, moments of the clock chiming shock us into silence and remind us all of our fleeting existence. The occasional funeral we attend, or brush with illness, or close call on the highway, before we all then inevitably plunge ourselves back into denial. For readers at the time, this lavish description of the masquerade setting would have been captivating. Visually and atmospherically, it's very gothic, the winding suite of rooms suggesting secretiveness and surprises around each corner, the stained glass, the tripods of fire casting shadows, and the grotesque variety of costumes all create an eerie scene that gets even weirder at the arrival of an unexpected guest. As the clock prepares to strike 12 at midnight, the revelers, hundreds of costumed figures, find themselves once more paused by dread. Even the wisest and happiest of Prospero's guests are pale and nervous this time, as the sound of that terrible clock seems to shake the rooms. It is then that some of the partygoers become acutely aware of a new presence among them. A guest that nobody noticed during the night's festivities is making his way slowly through the crowd. He is described as a tall, gaunt, and rigid man with a corpse-like posture. His costume is terrifying, shrouded from head to toe in funeral garments. The mask is not playful, rather, it has been painted to look eerily realistic, making guests do a double take because it looks like the face of a dead man. His robe is splattered with what looks like blood, and his face and brow are made up to be marked with scarlet. Someone at the party has decided to dress like a victim of the Red Death. Worse, he staggers and moves slowly and deliberately, like somebody actually afflicted with the disease. He moves silently, and as he does, the guests shrink back. Many are terrified, but more than that, they are enraged. They read this grotesque costume as a cruel mockery of the plague which has swept across the country. When Prince Prospero finally notices the man, he initially reacts with fear, but soon, like the others, his fear turns to explosive rage at this intrusion and insult. After all, the whole point of closing off the castle is to escape any mention or worry of the Red Death, and infuriated, the prince calls out to the partygoers to seize the man and unmask him, exclaiming, "Who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise." And yet, the crowd is so terrified that no one moves to obey the prince. It's a joke, of course, but still, what if it isn't? What if somehow, some way, a commoner with the Red Death has found their way into the celebration? The strange figure passes within a few yards of the prince, who stands paralyzed, either in fear or shock at the ghastly sight. Enraged at his own momentary cowardice, Prince Prospero takes up a dagger and personally pursues the man through all of the rooms, from blue to black. A deadly silence prevails as everyone watches this confrontation. The figure enters the dark, shadowy black room. Just as Prospero rushes to stab him, the figure suddenly turns to face him. There is an ear-splitting cry, and the prince drops his dagger and falls dead upon the black carpet. The other guests, summoning their courage, surge into the black room and grab the intruder and tear away his mask and his clothes, only to reel back in horror, for there is nothing underneath. No tangible form at all. The true terror dawns on them. The Red Death itself has infiltrated their midst. One by one, the partygoers collapse, dying in that blood-splattered black room. The ebony clock stops chiming, just as the last of the revelers perishes, and the firelight goes out, leaving only darkness, decay, and the Red Death reigning over everything. Readers in the 1840s would have found the Masque of the Red Death both shocking and satisfying. The image of the bloody specter confronting an arrogant prince and pompous partygoers is classic Gothic horror. For a 19th century audience, this was the stuff of nightmares, a skulking killer moving through a crowd. Readers with a moralistic bent would see justice served. These nobles who tried to ignore the suffering outside meet a fitting end, falling victim to the Red Death's divine retribution. The point of the story is plain: no one escapes death. This was arguably one of the most strikingly written horror stories of its day. It solidified Poe's reputation as a master of the macabre, one who could tap into the deepest anxieties of his era: the stealth of disease, the fragility of life, the false security of wealth, and the certainty of death, and package them all together into a bloody good story. One of my favorite videos that I've ever watched about Edgar Allan Poe is from Tale Foundry. Edgar Allan Poe, actually a sci-fi author? It's a fascinating piece that digs into a side of Poe that almost never gets attention. We all know about his gloomy, gothic, raven and ruin side, but this video shows how deeply obsessed he also was with things like science and the weird, imaginative properties of the universe, reframing him as more than a mere horror author, but instead someone reaching toward a science fiction genre before it really even existed. Tale Foundry does such a great job of making literary analysis simple and fun, and this video was sponsored by their original series, Worldsmiths, which explores the inner worlds of great artists and creators, how their lives, ideas, obsessions, and creative rules shape the things they make. If you want to take a behind-the-scenes peek into the lives of writers like H.P. Lovecraft or Sir Arthur Arthur Conan Doyle, just like we did learning a bit about Poe today, Worldsmiths will be right up your alley, and you can watch it on Nebula, a creator-owned streaming service where you'll find tons of exclusive videos, including some from yours truly, without having to sit through a single ad. This month they're running a special deal offering a whole year of access for just $30. Just visit go.nebula.tv/AustinMcConnell, scan the code, or check out the links below. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains, sudden dizziness, then profuse bleeding from the pores, ending in death. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the plague mark, which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and ladies of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall encircled it. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massive hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of entry nor exit to the sudden impulses of despair from outside or frenzy from inside. The abbey was amply provisioned with such precautions the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all means of entertainment. There were buffoons, there were storytellers, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there were cards, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was towards the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, this masquerade, but first let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the eye embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which followed the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was decorated in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the windows. The fourth was furnished and lit with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon the carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, The color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood red color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro, hung from the ceiling. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers, but in the corridors that followed the suite there stood opposite to each window a heavy tripod, bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illuminated the room, and thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic effects. But in the western, or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the faces of those who entered that there were few of the company bold enough to step inside at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when its minute hand made the circuit of the face and the hour was to be stricken, there came forth from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour the musicians in the orchestra were constrained to pause for a moment in their performance to listen to the sound, and thus the waltzers necessarily ceased their movements, and there was a brief confusion of the whole gay company, and while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and that the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows, as if in confused dreaming or meditation. But when the echoes had finally ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows each to the other that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embrace 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock. And there were the same disconcert and trembling and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a merry and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decorum of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers upon occasion of this great festival, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the costumes of the masqueraders. To be sure, they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and accessories. There were delirious fancies such as a madman fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams. And these, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as an echo in their steps, and soon there strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of the velvet, and then, for a moment, all is still, and all is silent, save the voice of the clock. The dreams are frozen stiff as they stand. But the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber, which lies westernmost of the seven, there were now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls, and to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal, more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears who indulge in the more remote fantasies of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life. And the revel went whirlingly on until at length was sounded the 12th hour upon the clock. And then the music ceased, as I have told, and the movements of the waltzes were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who reveled, and thus again it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before, and the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur, expressive at first of disapproval and surprise, then finally of terror, of horror, and of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the heart of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests, there are matters of which no jest can be properly made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the garments of the grave. The mask, which had concealed the face, was so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the deception. And yet all of this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revelers around, but the masked man had gone so far as to take on the form of the Red Death. His clothing was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow with all the features of the face was sprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of the Prince Prospero fell upon the spectral image, which with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzes, he was seen to be convulsed in the first moment with a strong shudder, either of terror or distaste, but in the next, his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares?" he demanded, hoarsely, of the group that stood around him. "Who dares make a mockery of our woes? Unmask the scoundrel, that we may know whom we have to hang tomorrow at sunrise from the battlements. Will no one stir at my bidding? Stop him and strip him, I say, of those reddened garments of sacrilege." It was in the eastern blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang through the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music became hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now with deliberate and stately step made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there was found none who reached out a hand to seize him, so that unimpeded he passed within a yard of the prince's person. And while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the room to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber, to the purple, through the purple, to the green, through the green, to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, before a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly around and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterward fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mystery man, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the funeral shrouds and corpse-like mask which they handled with so violent a rudeness empty of any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-drenched halls of their revel, and died each in despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the merry, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held limitless dominion over all.